Hello and welcome back to another video. It is your host Union, and in this one we'll be talking about the upcoming Russian summer offensive and what goes beyond that. Because Ukrainian Presidential Office Deputy Head Colonel Pavlo Palisa claims that Russia seeks to seize roughly 222,000 additional square kilometers by the end of 2026, or the entire eastern bank of the Dnieper River, as well as the majority of the Dnipropetrovsk, Mykolaiv, and Odessa regions, while also expanding slightly into additional regions here along the border area. From this, we can see that the Ukrainians expect that the Russians will launch a large-scale offensive in 2026. Although we see that their expectations for 2025 is that the Russians continue offensive operations along the four regions in the south to gain control over the entirety of the Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions. The Ukrainians do not expect any major offensives to take control of half the country this year, but in 2026. Instead, they expect the Russians to launch an operation along the entire border to create this so-called buffer zone. There are certainly some things that Pavlo Palisa gets right. The fact that the Russians plan on creating a buffer zone, gaining control over this entire area, and getting control over the four regions are likely true. The four regions, for sure. The buffer zone, they have officially said it. This large area has not officially been stated, but based on the fact that the Russians continue to expand their military and to double down on fighting this war until they win it, they are clearly aiming for more than simply capturing these four regions. And going beyond this does not make a lot of sense, because the Russian argument for this war, one of them at least, is to protect the Russian-speaking population of Ukraine. And considering Ukraine as a country, the eastern parts are majorly Russian-speaking, and the western parts are majorly Ukrainian-speaking. This means that a population disparity between the east and the west does exist. It also exists between the north and the south. This is why areas such as Odessa and Mykolaiv are included in this assessment. It was also, historically speaking, the Novorossiya part of Ukraine, which consists of the Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk, Mykolaiv, and Odessa, as well as Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk. Militarily speaking, gaining control over the eastern bank of the Dnieper River makes a lot of sense to have as a natural barrier, a geographical barrier between the Russian and Ukrainian side. So based on this, we can estimate that this is likely to be the end goal of the Russians. In that case, this timeline of by the end of 2026, is that realistic? Realistically speaking, it is possible, but unlikely. As we currently see, the Russians are not able to reach the 222,000 additional square kilometers unless the Ukrainian army completely collapses. Otherwise, currently, compared to last year, the Russians are expanding the zone of control at about 3 times the rate they were doing in 2024 in the first 6 months of it. However, we also see that the Ukrainians are really struggling to launch any sort of counterattack compared to last year. What I'm saying is that the situation for the Russians are definitely improving, but not at a fast enough pace to gain control of this entire area unless the Ukrainian army collapses or withdraws. The possibility of that is realistic, considering that the US so far does not seem to be increasing the amount of supplies, nor returning to giving the Ukrainians significant amounts of military supplies as they did in prior years under Joe Biden, as they are now doing under Donald Trump. If it continues at the current rate, the Ukrainians would have a difficult time resupplying their forces, and if they are unable to properly mobilize new soldiers that are motivated as well, then the Ukrainian forces could face a collapse with additional Russian advances, especially as the front line stretches wider and wider. The Ukrainians would need more and more soldiers and equipment to hold back Russian forces, and the Russian forces seem to be recruiting at a rate that the Ukrainians cannot compare to, simply due to the disparity in the population between the two sides. Ukraine currently has approximately 30 million people living in Ukraine, as the rest have either fled or come under Russian control, while the Russians have approximately 150 million people, or potentially a bit less. In either case, it's approximately 5-to-1 advantage to the Russians in terms of population, and that is without any mobilization on the Russian side, but active recruitment, including people from Central Asia, but mainly Russians and immigrants to Russia. This allows the Russians to have a lot of soldiers and recruiting at a scale that the Ukrainians cannot compare to. And at the same time, the Russian military industrial complex is building new weapons at a much faster pace than the entirety of the West combined. In terms of artillery, 3-to-1, in terms of drones, with help from China and China's reduced trade with Ukraine. Then the Russians are also outpacing the Ukrainians significantly in drones. In terms of missiles, the Russians will now be creating thousands of missiles every year. In terms of tanks, they're already creating thousands of tanks every year, while the Ukrainians, since the start of the war, really have at most gained somewhere around 1,000 to 2,000 tanks entirety from the entire Western support. This shows that Ukraine simply cannot compare to the Russians in terms of quantity, neither in terms of equipment nor manpower, despite the help from Western countries. And that is why I say the 2026, at the end of 2026 goal is possible but unrealistic. It's possible because at the current pace of production and recruitment, the Russians will significantly outnumber the Ukrainians, which could lead to a collapse, especially if the more motivated soldiers don't live long enough to see the end of 2026, in comparison to the Russians mainly doing it on a recruitment basis, which means that the motivation will likely stay the same from now on to 2026. In either the case, that is the end goal, and there's a year and a half for this. We have the September 1st, which is in 3 months' time. Then there's the end of 2025, which is in 6 months' time. 2 different goals. The first goal, gaining control over a significant portion of the Donetsk region. We can also see the Zaporizhia region is in the same color, which means that the Ukrainians expect the Russians to continue their intense offensive operations within the Donetsk region, but also to expand it into the Zaporizhia region, where they will be unable to gain control over the city. However, they will reach the outskirts of it and bypass the fortified positions of the Ukrainians within the Zaporizhia region. Based on the mapping, we can see that the Russians will be attacking, according to the Ukrainians, into the Dnipropetrovsk region. The objective will be to gain control over supply hubs of the Ukrainians along the border between the Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk regions, to bypass the city of Pokrovsk, which will allow them to gain control over a significant portion of the western parts of the Donetsk region, and then continue their siege upwards through the Kościantynivka-Sloviansk line, rather than directly storming it head-on from the sides on a wide front. They'll be concentrating their forces in the rear and weak point of this defensive line to gain control of it bit by bit. At the same time, they'll be attacking in the western direction with the supply lines from the Donetsk city itself, which is a major supply hub that can supply an entire army group. This shows that a Russian offensive towards the rear of Zaporizhia is very much possible, with the highways and the railways connecting the Russian forces from the city of Donetsk to the western parts to Ukrainian logistical hubs such as Pokrovsk, and if they gain control over Pokrovsk as well, they'll be able to have a strong force in the direction of Zaporizhia from the rear, bypassing these fortified positions, while at the same time storming them head-on will have a massive effect on the Ukrainian supply capability and can potentially operationally encircle or completely encircle the Ukrainian forces along the defensive lines, and the front line can look something like this at the end of the year. At the start of September, that is much less realistic, but if a large push, a all-out offensive by the Russians within the Donetsk region into the Dnipropetrovsk region to the rear of Zaporizhia happens, then by the 1st of September it's possible. This means this deadline is only possible if the Russians launch a large-scale offensive in the southern section of the front line. As for the 2025, end of 2025 deadline, advancing along the border area, creating a buffer zone, and at the same time capturing the Kherson Oblast, these are two different aspects we have to look at. The border zone area, that is very much realistic. We're already seeing some operations by the Russians. The Russians will look to gain control over sections of the border in the coming months along the front line between the Sumy, Kharkiv, and Chernihiv regions. The Russians gaining a buffer zone along the entire front line by the end of the year is very much possible. We'll have to see if the Russians are able to concentrate a large enough force along the entire border area to cover the entire border area, enter into the Ukrainian side, and dig down and entrench themselves along the entire border area. This will depend on whether or not the Ukrainians have a significant amount of soldiers in reserve. If they have a significant amount of soldiers in reserve, this can become difficult for the Russians. But as it stands right now, it seems that it's very much possible for the Russians to reach this deadline. As for the Kherson operation, although it is a very difficult scenario for the Russians to cross over the Dnieper River and gain control over the Kherson region, it is also similar to the border area, very much possible by the end of the year. And again, it depends on the same thing, whether the Ukrainians have a significant amount of soldiers in reserve. If the Russians launch a general offensive across the entire border area from Kherson in the south to Chernihiv in the north, then the Ukrainians would have to spread out their forces along the entire section of the front line, and then it becomes very difficult for them to deal with a concentrated offensive by the Russians. The Dnieper River is a strong natural barrier, but if there are barely any Ukrainian soldiers defending it, then it does not mean too much, as the Russians would be able to concentrate their own forces, bombard the Ukrainian positions, and attack and cross over the river line in a strong offensive, concentrating their forces. The Ukrainians concentrating their forces is much less likely, because if it happens, then the Russians can concentrate their own forces and launch an attack where the Ukrainian forces are extremely weak and exposed. That is the advantage of having a significant amount of soldiers, by far surpassing that of the opposing side. And that is where we saw in 2022 the Ukrainian recapture of the Kharkiv region, Izium, and really both banks of the Uskar River line. This happened due to the Russians being significantly outnumbered by the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians being able to detect gaps in the Russian defenses, collapsing a section of the front line. This can happen to the Ukrainians if the Russians significantly outnumber the Ukrainians. And this is why the Russians are looking to expand the full section of the front line. Currently, they have approximately 800,000 soldiers within Ukraine, and that is completely covering every single meter, really, of the front line with constant reconnaissance and fighting. Now they have, according to Ukrainian sources, almost 200,000 soldiers in reserve along the border area. If those engage in battle, then the Ukrainians would be spread out even more, and they would have to thin their front line, where we're already seeing the Russians capturing approximately 25 square kilometers a day. This can double or triple to 50 or 75 simply by expanding the front line. And as the situation grinds on, where the Russians completely bombard Ukrainian positions with their superior firepower and additional equipment, then this can increase to a higher pace, and with a concentrated offensive, then the Russians can reach the goal. So in the end, my conclusion to this analysis is all of these goals and timelines are possible. However, it depends on the Ukrainian ability to mobilize and train their soldiers, and the Western ability to supply the Ukrainians with the equipment and ammunition that they need to defend these positions. In that scenario, the Ukrainians might be able to delay this from happening. As for stopping it completely, it is unlikely. And that is going to be all for this analysis. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching, and have a great day.